Guys, we're going to go ahead and get started in just about another minute. So if you find a seat, you'll be ready for Gene Epstein.
That's what I was talking about.
Guys, we're going to go ahead and get started. If everybody would take their seats. You guys have been an incredible audience. We have been able to stay on time. You have been wonderful and attentive. And when it's been time to get back to the speakers, you've been ready for that. So thank you so much. I have the distinct honor to introduce our next speaker. That's Gene Epstein. Gene is the founder and moderator of the Soho Debate Forum, the former chief economist for the New York Stock Exchange, and the former economics editor at Barron's Magazine, but for the LPMC. I know especially for Mike, he has been an incredible mentor and a strategist for us and a ferocious supporter of ours, and we absolutely support it, and we are so glad you're here. Ladies and gentlemen, Gene Epstein.
Thank you. Thank you. I am indeed a great admirer of Michael Haidt, a guy I've gotten to know so well, modest, committed, and filled with integrity. And so it's an honor to be invited by him to speak about what he asked me to speak about, Austrian economics, and I've expanded it to a theme, which is how I became a libertarian through the gateway drug of Austrian economics. And if you stick around, once I get the 5-minute warning, I'm going to be addressing two burning questions. One is, can you subscribe to Austrian economics without being a libertarian? The other will be, can you be a libertarian without subscribing to Austrian economics? Burning questions that I'm sure you'll want the answer to, which I'm going to give you toward the end of my talk. Well, the imminent Jewish holiday, Passover, causes us Jews once again to reflect that we have a lot to answer for with respect to freedom, which is what Passover is, after all about. Karl Marx was a Jew, descended from rabbis, Leon Trotsky, and of course, Bernie Sanders, just to mention three Jews who played an important role in desecrating the cause of freedom. But we do have an answer to that because we are actually sitting in the neighborhood of the Jew who was the greatest free market economist of the 20th century, Ludwig von Mises, who lived here in his rent-controlled apartment about 20 blocks uptown from here. And then his student, the greatest libertarian thinker of the 20th century, another Jew, Murray Rothbard. And I want to presume to be in line with them and maybe recognize some other great Jews in the audience. I noticed that Dave Smith has arrived. He's got a Goyish name. And there is a rumor that, like another great Jew, he's the product of a virgin birth. But in fact, I gather that he was born normally, but he is a great Jewish libertarian. And there is even a rumor about Tom Woods, who's here in the audience as well, that he changed his name from Woodstein for business reasons. And we might change back. And then there is me. There's me. My mother, as I made plain both on Dave's show and on Tom's show, Mommy was a commie. And she trained me to be a Stalinist, a staunch Stalinist at the age of 7. The FBI file on her literally says she had thick ankles. And I regard that as an anti-Semitic slur. So clearly, she was a great Jew as well. But then there's me. I am in a direct line to Murray Rothbard and to Ludwig von Mises in this way, as I'll explain. Now, just to fill you in, it's called Austrian economics, as most of you know, because it came from Austria. A lot of great guys, Eugene von Bauer, Karl Menger, and in fact Hayek as well, they were Austrians, and then there was the Jew Ludwig von Mises. Ironically, we have Hitler to thank for the fact that I'm standing here. Because if you can consider the connection, Ludwig von Mises fled Austria because of Hitler initially to Switzerland and then finally ended up in New York City. Had that not happened, I think our history would have been very, very different. Because Murray Rothbard, a brilliant Brooklyn Jew, wandered into Mises' seminar and was turned around, became an Austrian economist. Now cut to 50 years ago, literally, Gene the Jew, Gene Epstein, that's me, I picked up a copy of Man, Economy, and State and read it. And I've been teaching economics at the time. For me, I was demoralized. I didn't know I didn't know whether there was only such thing as economics. I experienced one eureka moment after another. And then I gradually discovered the difference between Austrian economics and mainstream economics, and why Austrian economics inevitably leads you to go to the root of things, to think radically, while mainstream economics does not. Well, the mainstream economists basically tout a couple of things. Number one, when you think about something, think about it from a top-down perspective, because after all, who the hell wants to be a sloppy-ass economist lecturing indifferent students in a classroom when you can be head of the Federal Reserve, when you can run the Treasury, when you can sit at the tables of power? So think in terms of the powerful when you think about economics. Then more precisely as well, from the mainstream perspective, turn it into a branch of physics. Recognize that we are all scientists, and that what we do when we investigate economics is that we look at the data and then we draw inductive conclusions from the data. And then we put it in math when we can, in order to make it even more obscure. Well, all sounds very scientific, with the exception, of course, to the libertarians as the offensive idea of thinking from a top-down perspective. But isn't it correct to just look at data and interpret it? Well, the Austrians came along and they said something very different. What they said was that, no, it's all in our head. It's all in what we can think about in terms of human action, because after all, economics is all about human action under a condition of scarcity. And by the way, another economist who I think was deeply Austrian, even though he wouldn't admit to it, was Thomas Sowell, great black economist Thomas Sowell, who could define scarcity in terms of what made sense in terms of human action. What is scarcity? What everybody wants always adds up to more than there is. And if you read Sowell, by the way, it's the same kind of approach, which is that we are thinking about it in our heads. How would we act under conditions of scarcity with prices? What choices do we make? And then you build scenarios, mental images in your mind, and you draw deductions from those mental images. That it all starts with human action. The title, of course, of Ludwig von Mises's magnum opus, which deeply influenced Murray Rothbard to write Man, Economy, and State, which deeply influenced me. Now, that sounds solipsistic, narcissistic, anti-scientific, and yet the dirty little secret of the mainstream is that they practice Austrian economics also. That the truth of the matter is that while they pretend that they're only looking at data, when they actually think about it, they themselves lapse into that inevitable way of thinking, at least when they are making sense. Sometimes they do make sense. And the irony is that you can often read mainstream economists who are trained in all that bullshit who can occasionally make sense because they can occasionally discuss economics from a decent point of view, of the Austrian point of view. Let's take the insight of supply and demand. I prefer to call it an insight rather than a law. It's an insight, supply and demand. Why is it true? Well, it's true, just for starters, because we human beings, we tend to place priority on the first units of a good and then lower priority in terms of use on the next units of a good. We drink the water initially, that's the most important use for it. We sometimes use it to put out fires. Then we swim in it, then we bathe in it, in terms of a descending order of priority, because that's the way the vast majority of us naturally think and work. And so when you think of the ways in which we allocate goods that were given in terms of lower and lower orders of use and priority, that gives you the key to why more supply will generally lead to a lower price. Now, I ask some mainstream economists occasionally, we have a lot more supply of most things over the decades. Why aren't prices generally a lot lower? Doesn't that puzzle you? Well, the answer is it doesn't puzzle them at all. They know full well that they don't derive the laws of supply and demand from the data, because if you look to the data, you start concluding the opposite. We've got more of this stuff, more per capita of this stuff, and yet prices are higher. They don't puzzle over that. It's not a mystery to them because they too think like Austrians, what we call a priori, apodictic ways about human action and what we can infer from human action. Well, that brings us to money, and I want to talk a lot about money because money and banking has, of course, been in the news, and maybe we can shed a few insights on that. Milton Friedman was a good example because he was a semi-libertarian Jew, I might mention, had a huge influence, which we, of course, are proud of. But Milton Friedman didn't suffer from the idea that everything should be top down. He had a real libertarian streak in that regard. But he wrote the craziest methodology paper, which became famous and indeed infamous, in which he said that the reasoning of economics depends on looking at the data and then making predictions about what would happen. In fact, he even went so far as to say, let's imagine you're analyzing people who are playing pool. You don't have to have the least bit of understanding about what the real purpose of the pool game is. All you have to do is chart the data, and you see how the balls end in holes and hit other balls. So all you have to do is have an abstract understanding of what's going on. You don't have to explain anything. It just has to have predictive value. That's the brilliant Milton Friedman talking such incredible hogwash that he himself forsook over and over again. When it came to his trying to explain to people how price inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, always and everywhere because of the expansion of money, of course he reasoned like an Austrian. He used mental experiments to explain it. I mean, the simplest way to explain it is just to use the Bitcoin example. Imagine the money supply can't expand at all. You have more goods and services and more labor and more market transactions. How is that going to happen unless prices fall. If you double the amount of supply, double the amount of labor, and yet there's the same amount of money that can't expend at all, you're going to have declining prices. And indeed, obviously, you're going to have rising prices if money expands. So Friedman was a primary example of someone who violated his own methodology paper over and over again. And that's why there's so much of Milton Friedman that is worth reading, worth considering. But then we Austrians ask certain questions about money that you will, these days at least, not find at all in the standard money and banking texts. They're not the least bit curious as to how money has value. They just make a statement. It is a medium of exchange. They do get into the barter issue fairly well recently, like Austrians. Murray Rothbard used to like to use the example of he's got to buy us a newspaper at the newsstand every morning, and he could barter it for a 5-minute lecture on economics to the guy who runs the newsstand, but the guy is not going to accept that. So he needs money to give the guy for the newspaper so the guy can buy the pork chops that he really wants to buy. He doesn't want to buy an economics lecture with the money. So Rothbard, of course, put it well, and by and large, by the way, the mainstream puts it okay as well, because they reason, like Austrians, about the advantages of money over barter. And that's fine. But then Austrians ask a question, which is, where does money get any value at all? Why are we using it? What's doing with it? In fact, in the old days, years ago, the textbooks used to have this concomitant simultaneous equation concept, which made no sense at all because they could only think in terms of mathematics. Well, the Austrians basically say, we use money today not because we're smart or brilliant, we use money because of what it could buy yesterday. We know it could buy a lot. Yes, somebody gives us $100. We know approximately what $100 could buy yesterday, and that's pretty much our dumb frame of reference. We're not brilliant. We're just acting in terms of human action. Yesterday, we used money for what it could buy the day before. The day before that, we used it for what it could buy the day before that. Now, don't we then logically have to regress back in time? And that's why Ludwig von Mises called it the regression theorem, that we're regressing back in time, because once you go back in time, at some point you have to hit time zero. And you can't keep going, you can't regress infinitely. Ultimately, there had to have been a point in which there was no yesterday. Well, that's where Mises and Menger, another Austrian, inferred, to some degree, of course, inspired by the existence of gold, that all money had to have started from a commodity that could be commonly used and traded, the kind of commodity that everybody would accept. And that's the regression theorem. And that, by the way, when I initially read Man, Economy, State, there's something about that blew my Talmudic mind. It's not the most, but it's just that you could think deductively about human behavior and come to what had to be a rock bottom historic truth. The government doesn't create money. That it starts from a commodity, seashells, gold. It starts from a commodity that had value. So I'm going to give you gold. That has value, and you'll give me your eggs. So that was on day zero, when we didn't have a yesterday. And then there's a fascinating and classic article about a British POW camp during World War II, where they all got care packages. And the care packages had a lot of items that you wanted and a lot of items you didn't want. So they were going to barter what was in the care packages with each other. And they found there was no coincidence of once. It was difficult to trade what was in my care package with yours. And so very quickly, they started to use cigarettes as their medium of exchange. They didn't have gold, but they had cigarettes. Everybody smoked in those days, and virtually everybody. So again, it started from time zero, and of course, eventually the cigarettes became money in the POW camp. Now, I want to now belittle a couple of people, just for the heck of it. I don't know if you've heard of another Jew, an Israeli guy named Yuval Harari. Okay, well, all right. I'm going to go along with your booze guy because Yuval Harari is filled with these mind-blowing incidents because he should read a little Austrian economics and maybe he'd be a little grounded and wouldn't shoot his mouth off about money. But he famously said, "The truly unique trait of sapiens is our ability to create and believe fiction. Of course, not all fictions are shared by all humans, but at least one has become universal in our world, and this is money. Money is a fiction. Money is probably the most successful story ever told. It has no objective value, but then you have these master storytellers, the big bankers, the finance ministers, and they come and they tell a very convincing story." So again, because he maybe took an economics course from the mainstream and they were unable and not even the least bit interested to understand why money has value, he invented this fantasy. But then most appallingly and to my dismay, I came across this from a new book by a guy named John Cochrane, whom some of you may have heard of. He's at the Hoover Institute. He was trained in the Chicago School, and he's often a very smart free market guy. But he wrote a book that's just out called The Fiscal Theory of the Price Level. And in the beginning of this book reads this way: "Money is valued because the government accepts money for tax payments. If on April 15th you have to come up with these specific pieces of paper or these specific bits in the computer, then you will work hard to get them. Money gains value in exchange because it is valuable on tax day." The idea seems pretty simple and obvious, but as you'll see, it leads to surprising conclusions. Well, I didn't stick around to see, because the conclusions that you could draw from this nonsensical statement were only going to lead to more nonsense. But oddly enough, you could say that he is sort of thinking like an Austrian, but he's also thinking like a top-down guy. I mean, a lot of people, the lower half of the population, barely pays any taxes, and yet most of it, they pay an awful lot of money to Walmart because that's where things are cheap. So we could just as well say, with the same kind of ludicrousness, that money has value because Walmart accepts money, and that every week we go to Walmart and we need the money. Well, the truth of the matter is that the money arises, and we tend to use the money that's most common, and it all starts from a commodity. It's not because of the government, and indeed, in the British POW camp, they didn't have a government. Money arose that way. Or indeed, in terms of a simple manual experiment, if we have an ANCAP society that will use gold or Bitcoin, it doesn't need government in order to have a medium of exchange. And so this was an odd, quirky thing where, I mean, by the way, Paul Krugman had also written something like this. Now I could understand Paul Krugman saying something as nonsensical as this, but for John Cochrane to say it was truly a bit depressing. And again, it seems to come from some kind of top-down mindset. Now, of course, as I'm sure you're asking, well, we're talking about Federal Reserve notes, paper dollars. How does that trace back to a commodity? Well, as you know, as I imagine you know, it was by a very slow process over many decades that the government gradually started dollars from gold, fixed to the exchange in gold, so it was anchored in the commodity, anchored in gold, and they gradually unanchored it, slowly enough so that the regression theorem and connection back to gold, back to commodity was not severed, and that's why we use dollars. Well, now, Austrians, of course, will ask and then another related question about money. Why do we need the government? Why do we need the federal government to be so involved with the money supply at all? What's the purpose of that? And that's, of course, the last kind of question the money in banking textbooks are going to ask. For them, because they're superficially not thinking to the root, and because, of course, they like the existence of the Federal Reserve. At the Seoul Forum Debate Society, we had a debater named Frederick Mishkin who defended the Federal Reserve, and indeed, he'd worked for the Federal Reserve, so therefore, to some degree, I had to think that that's where his bread was buttered. And many economists, of course, dream of having that great job, being a master of the universe at the Federal Reserve. So now I'm going to ask, what is the purpose of this institution? Why did government ever get involved in the money supply at all? I think it's, again, we can draw a fairly obvious inference. We can think in terms of how government needs to raise its money. It can tax, it can borrow, but if it borrows, it's going to be borrowing against future taxes. So there's a kind of a limit on how much money it can raise through borrowing, or it can print the money. But the only way for it to be able to print the money is, of course, for it to have control of the people's money. And now we get a little bit, our Austrian insight leads us to a little bit of understanding of history, that the kings needed to fight their wars. They wanted to fight their wars. They could raise money for the war through taxing and borrowing, but isn't it much simpler to sort of have control of the people's gold and print money against that gold, debase the gold, finance the war not through taxing or borrowing, but through seizing the people's money. And the central banks really then are just a very good mechanism whereby, a very convenient mechanism whereby that can happen. And I like to quote this sentence from, where is it? From George Griezmann. Where am I going to find it? That when we talk about the ability of the government to create money and not ask the people for money, aren't we offending the liberals? At least those people who are not necessarily Austrians or libertarians, but don't we realize then that the government's power to print money is clearly an offense to those, at least, who believe in the history of, in the importance of democracy. Alan Greenspan, who wrote The Age of Turbulence, and he was, of course, for many years a head of the Federal Reserve. Prior to that, at the age of 40, he wrote an article about gold, and it reads like out of Karl Marx. I actually have the impression that Ayn Rand wrote a lot of it for him. It's a fiery article about gold and the ruling classes. But Greenspan wrote in 2007, in The Age of Turbulence, I have long since acquiesced in the fact that the gold standard does not readily accommodate the widely accepted view of the appropriate functions of government. The propensity of Congress to create benefits for constituents without specifying the means by which they are funded. In other words, Congress can create benefits for constituents without specifying the means by which they're funded, and that's okay with Greenspan. That's fine. And that's, of course, because if they were on a gold standard, if they were tethered to a gold standard, they couldn't print money. And George Griezmann, who also was a student of Mises, wrote in his book Capitalism a nice statement that I like to read to the skeptics about the role of the Federal Reserve and the role of the government in money. When the government need not obtain its funds from the people, but instead can supply the people with funds, it can no longer easily be viewed as deriving its powers from the people. The ability to inflate enables the government to throw off its status as a servant of the people, deriving its just powers from the consent of the governed, and to appear instead in the guise of the provider and father of the people, with the people deriving their existence, power, and rights from the government. A greater revolution in the relationship between the people and the government cannot be imagined. Well, I have to confess, as someone who ran the Seoul Forum, I hosted a debate on the Federal Reserve. And the argument made by the economists who wanted to abolish the Federal Reserve was mostly practical and instrumental. I thought it was unfortunate that he didn't play the political card. He didn't realize how much the power of the government to print money is such a direct affront to the rights of the people. Now, indeed, we can say taxation is theft. We can say borrowing against taxation is also theft. But the power to print money is like it's like you're not burglarizing the home, you take over the home and you kick out the people who live there. It's such an extreme seizure of power that it should offend not just libertarians, it should offend everyone. And in fact, I'm not going to read this, but I came across recently a quote from, of all people, John Maynard Keynes, who wrote about this in 1919, although 5 years later, he was calling the gold standard the barbarous relic. Well, what else do we infer as Austrians to pursue this point about the role of the Federal Reserve and how banking might work? Perhaps I can't elaborate on this fully, but what we realize is that if the Federal Reserve creates the kind of monopoly that we have today, that obviously what recently happened with the price inflation, I've shown this a number of times on my Twitter account, Gene So Forum, if you want to follow me on Twitter, is I show a chart showing that the money supply measured as M2, a very conventional measure of money that Milton Friedman created from 1960 to the present. If you just look at the 12 and 24-month changes in it, it exploded off the charts in 2021, 22. Exploded off the charts. Nothing like it in terms of expansion had happened since now, going back to the data since 1960. And then if you look at the data kept by the Federal Reserve on its ownership of treasuries, the treasury of debt, that exploded by the trillions around the same time. And then, of course, we know that's when the lockdowns hit and when the government was spending trillions in debt that the Federal Reserve then monetized. That monetization led to an explosion in M2, which, of course, resulted in the price inflation that we're looking at now. Now, most of that, I have to agree, by the way, partly because really the monitors, when they talk about this, they talk like Austrians. They're telling the same sort of story. Well, you have to have an explosion of the money supply to see any kind of big noticeable explosion in prices. So we don't necessarily need the Austrians for that. We do need the Austrians to be able to point out the other problems that creates, and we apparently need the Austrians to point out to people that this gives extraordinary power to government that the founding fathers would never have envisioned. There's nothing about creating the Federal Reserve, and the Constitution just echoed the talk delivered by my illustrious predecessor this morning. Well, the other issue that the Austrians can probe is when you have a Federal Reserve that has all its banks under it, you're essentially creating the sort of thing that antitrust should object to most, which is that you now have a sort of a banking cartel. That if the banks, any banks screw up, you have a backup that can print an endless amount of money and bail you out. And so one would think that if you like competition, if you're even a conventional economist or a conventional progressive liberal, you think, well, that's not such a good idea. If you have competition in banking, then the banks will discipline each other. That's what happens in any competitive market. If you took the egg market and you had a huge government agency of which all egg producers were a member, and if any of them screwed up or went bankrupt, the Federal Reserve would print money and bail them out. That's the sort of thing you would have in banking. So we begin to have sort of this self-evident idea that the Federal Reserve is not exactly an institution you want if you believe in conventional competition. But I guess you do end up with the I guess having to grapple with the ultimate faith that is instilled in us by the mainstream, which is that you can't trust the private sector, but you can trust the government. The government can be trusted to run the money supply, but if we left it to the private sector, things would run amok. Well, again, one would think that we might want to reverse that because most of the mainstream doesn't want the government running every other industry. Why do they want the government to run the money supply? And then most recently, or indeed at any time in our history, there was never a war, never a major war fought through taxation and borrowing. It was always fought through the printing of money. And when Dick Cheney, then Vice President under Bush, said famously, Reagan proved that deficits don't matter, he was more right than he knew. What he really meant, of course, is that deficits don't matter because the government can always print via the Federal Reserve. Well, how much time do I have left? 6 minutes, okay. I guess I got one more minute to shift gears completely and just talk about an issue with respect to Austrian economics where I have some disagreements with Austrians. I just want to mention that because there is a libertarian theme to it. Even in Human Action by Mises talks about sovereignty of consumers. And ironically, it really was important, and maybe still to this day it's important to point out that in a competitive marketplace, the people who run the companies are really working for the consumers. And that if you don't understand that, then it really should be cemented in your mind. That's not like they are calling the shots. They have to remain in business, and they've got to all businesses have ultimately got to sell to consumers. But I still find it upsetting. I still bridle at the idea that we want to talk about consumer sovereignty. I actually did hear on the Tom Woods show some guy being interviewed a couple of years ago who said, well, when it comes to foreign trade, we want the consumer to be sovereign, and we're voting for consumers rather than voting for producers. And it was really actually in Man, Economy, and State that Murray Rothbard said, no, we really don't have consumer sovereignty. Most of us, including me, the old, just to get back to the Jewish thing, what's a Jewish lawyer? A kid who couldn't get into medical school. And what's a Jewish journalist? Somebody like me who didn't want to be a lawyer. Now, if I was obeying consumer sovereignty, I guess I would have gone into something that would please consumers more. Most of us make choices in our business, in our lives, in our professions that deal with self-sovereignty. So the self-sovereignty on all sides of the economy, producers, workers, consumers. So the term consumer sovereignty, and there is an Austrian economist I respect who likes to use the term. In fact, there are a couple of others who do, and I do bridle at that. Really, in this economy, we are sovereign in all ways, and we are not just being ruled by consumers. Otherwise, we'd lead our lives very differently. Well, now I'm running out of time, so I have to answer the key questions. And the most important one is, well, can you subscribe to Austrian economics without being a libertarian? And I guess I would say that it's very difficult, very difficult to do that because, and of course you understand that I'm not talking about philosophy or the non-aggression principle, all of which are central to my being. I am saying, economics so forced to think to the root and of the consequences of people's actions, and think about how government acts in markets and how money came to be, and how the central bank works. That if you do subscribe to Austrian economics, it's difficult to be a libertarian. Although, let's add a little nuance. Ludwig von Mises was not an ANCAP; he was more of a classical liberal. So I'm opening the door to both minarchists and anarchist about being a libertarian. And so I would say that I really have not personally met someone who actually subscribes to Austrian economics without being a libertarian. And to reverse it, can you be a libertarian without subscribing to Austrian economics? Well, here, I'm going to sort of like betray the question. It's almost impossible not to subscribe to Austrian economics. And that gets back to my theme, which is that it is really true that if you read the journalism of some of the mainstream economists, you can often learn something. Because once they put aside all the bullshit about how they're looking at the data, they are usually using mental experiments, reasoning from human action. So it's almost impossible not to subscribe to Austrian economics. Therefore, the question is off the charts. We don't have to deal with it. But can you subscribe to Austrian economics without being a little libertarian? Almost impossible. And again, getting back to the broad theme, I owe it to Hitler. Hitler forced Ludwig Mises out of Europe. Ludwig Mises came to New York. Rothbard walked into that seminar, wrote all those great books. 50 years ago, I'm in the library of the New School, and then it's sort of reading Man, Economy, and State, being converted. And then, by the way, just to finish my personal story, there was a laissez-faire bookshop downtown on Mercer Street, a bricks and mortar bookshop. I lived on the Upper West Side, and I would go there every weekend to read up on the Austrians, and that's how I got converted. And I stand before you today, a Jewish libertarian. Thank you very much.
Going to go ahead and take a break, but before we break, I just want to, Jean, you have reminded me, we are the beneficiaries of an incredible and beautiful philosophy, but operationalizing that, recruiting with those ideas, building the Libertarian Party, the Libertarian movement is difficult. And I want to recognize two people very quickly who are making that happen for the Libertarian Party Mises Caucus every day, and that is Luke Enzer and Dylan Griffith, who run our social media accounts, making national headlines for weeks. Their hard work is growing this movement. I just wanted them to be recognized today. So we're on break until 1:55. So have some time to yourselves. Grab a beer from Fifth Company Brewing back in the corner and enjoy yourselves.
That's nepotism.
It's not nepotism. No, you're fine. You're great. Good.
You're great. Great to see you.
Yeah.